keep that in mind as we move forward. So I'd like to welcome our special guest today. We have Silas Chamberlin, Vice President of Economic and Community Development at the York County Economic Alliance, and Marc, President and CEO of the Arts Commission in Toledo, Ohio. And I think they're going to impart you with some really great wisdom. And since there are so many people on this call, as we move forward, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Okay, so without further ado, Silas, I'm going to pull up your slides. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks everybody for being on with us today. I'm going to go through a lot of information quickly, so just keep in mind that you'll get a copy of these slides, so no reason to furiously take notes on all this. Just for a little bit of background, the York County Economic Alliance is an economic development organization. We function as York County's Chamber of Commerce and Economic Development Corporation, our Business Improvement District Authority, our Main Street organization, and we staff a number of countywide authorities. So we are very squarely in the economic development space, but as you'll see, we think that complements very well a focus on arts and culture. So if you could go to the next slide. I'll just start with a disclaimer that, and really an encouragement, that although this presentation is going to focus on the arts and culture sector and how it aligns with ARPA, there are similar opportunities for those of you who are in organizations or serve on the boards of organizations that are active in a variety of different spaces, including conservation and tourism and placemaking. And many of those types of uses are also eligible for ARPA funding. The U.S. Treasury published their final rule on January 6th of this year, and a lot of communities had been waiting until that guidance came out before they made decisions. And that final rule will take effect April 1st. There has been an interim final rule in place for quite a while now, 6 months or so, I believe. And until that final rule takes place April 1st, the interim final rule remains in effect. So all that is to say, you are still able to make allocations today. Many communities have, but the final rule will take place April 1st. This presentation, I should say, is based on my personal interpretation of ARPA, so I don't work for the state or the U.S. Treasury or the federal government. This is just a reading of the guidance that is out there, and I would encourage you, if you haven't, to take a look at U.S. Treasury's final rule directly. They have a great fact sheet. They have FAQs on their website. And although it is a scary document, it's 437 pages long, it is also a PDF that can be searched and you can find information relatively quickly. So don't let that page count scare you if you're getting ready to dig into looking at some of this guidance. Next slide. So just an overview, if you're not that familiar with the American Rescue Plan Act, this was a act signed into law March 11th of 2021. It provided $1.9 trillion in economic stimulus that really covered a lot of different approaches to economic and community recovery and public health recovery that funded everything from reopening schools or equipping schools with PPE to testing and contact tracing to CDC vaccination distribution efforts to infrastructure. Within that, there was a big portion carved out that would go directly to states and to counties and to municipalities. Pennsylvania collectively received $7.5 billion, counties receiving direct allocations of $2.8 billion, and municipalities received a total of approximately $3.3 billion. So these are very, very significant amounts of money, obviously. You can go to the next slide. So who is getting the funding and how much? So every single county and individual municipality from the smallest borough to the largest city is getting an allocation of funding. And this funding can be used, as we'll talk about a lot, to aid all sorts of different recovery efforts and investments. County governments and municipalities that have more than 50,000 residents are receiving direct allocations from the federal government. So the U.S. Treasury is their direct direct conduit for the funding. And if you're not sure how much your county is receiving, there are tools out there. Obviously, you can't click on this screen, but there are tools out there to simply search how much did my county receive, and you'll see that in your Google responses. Municipalities with fewer than 50,000 residents are getting their funds through DCED, so the U.S. Treasury allocated to DCED, and then communities are working directly with DCED to get the funds. As I said, these direct allocations are very substantial. County allocations range from tens of millions to well over $100 million. And municipal allocations are significantly very large, ranging from tens of thousands of dollars to multiple millions of dollars. Just to show you statewide some examples, Westmoreland County is receiving $105 million directly as a county. And then, of course, every municipality within that county is receiving their own allocation. Clinton County, a more rural county, $7.5 million. Northampton County over in the Lehigh Valley, $61 million. But even small boroughs like Shamokin Dam Borough, Mifflinburg Borough, Railroad Borough right here in York County, that's a very small borough, getting $29,000. So everybody is getting this funding. There were just a very small handful of individual municipalities that declined the federal funding, but that is like literally a very small handful. So if you are in a municipality right now, or you work with one, or you work with a county, they have money available, and it is significant. Next slide, please. So how can the funds be used? And I will first start by showing you the ones that are explicitly called out in ARPA, and then we'll jump into arts and culture. So in the funding guidelines, those of you who are familiar with the CARES Act back in 2020 and tried to work with those funds, you knew that those funds were very restricted in how they could be used and had to be spent very quickly. This is a much longer horizon for how they can be allocated and a much broader set of uses. So the ones that the Treasury highlighted, especially early on in their interim rule, was supporting public health expenditures, which makes perfect sense. This is a response to a public health pandemic. Address negative economic impacts, which is very broad. That can be economic harms to workers, to households, to businesses, to specific sectors. Replacing lost public sector revenue. So that's recognizing that municipalities and counties are losing tax revenue and other fees due to business restrictions and other closures, and have additional costs. And that's a big piece of how these funds can be used. There's a formula in the guidelines that has helped municipalities and counties figure out how much they can request in revenue replacement. And the great thing about that funding for revenue replacement is it's unrestricted in how it's used. So I'm going to show you how the guidelines relate to specific uses, but keep in mind, municipalities and counties can just replace revenue and then use it however they see fit, with a couple minor caveats. The ARPA guidelines also called out investing in certain types of infrastructure, water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure at the top of that list. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the final category was addressing the tourism sector and getting businesses that support that sector and travel and hospitality industries restarted. Very early on, the Treasury, rightfully so, identified these sectors as among the hardest hit by the pandemic, and so they called them out in particular. The really important part of this is the caveat that the Treasury gives in their final rule that says, recipients also have broad flexibility to identify and respond to other pandemic impacts and serve other populations that experience pandemic impacts beyond those enumerated in the final rule. The interim final rule, which is the one that's in place now until April, has the exact same language. So that's pretty much saying throughout the guidelines, there's a lot of uses that are enumerated. They're called out specifically, but that's not an exhaustive list. And the reason that's important, if you go to the next slide, is because in that entire 437 pages of guidance, according to my count, the word arts shows up one time. And it's in reference to being part of a much larger set of nonprofits who have been significantly impacted. Culture, public art, other related terms that we care about are not listed at all. And so the gut reaction, I think, from a lot of municipal solicitors, county solicitors, even advocates for the arts and culture and other important sectors look at that and say, okay, well, then we're not eligible, we're not listed. And that is not the case. That is not what the Treasury has intended. And that's why they include throughout the guidelines notes that say there are uses of these funds that are not enumerated, and counties and municipalities can still choose to invest in those uses. The one other interesting thing, and it's relevant here in York County, it might be relevant in other counties, is that the Treasury has indicated that the same types of eligible uses under the CARES Act are also eligible under the Rescue Act. And back in 2020, during the CARES funding, when counties were making their allocations, many of them chose to invest in cultural sector assets and the creative economy in general. And so that sets a great precedent because that funding has been expended. Those communities have had to give final reports to DCD and the Treasury about how they use those funds. And so that set a good precedent that those were eligible uses. And now under the Rescue Act, continue to be eligible uses because the precedent was set during the CARES Act. So might seem like a tedious explanation, but the precedent here is really important because I think what many of you probably are experiencing, and I know we've experienced in talking to communities across Pennsylvania, is that there is a pushback from people who are giving a very strict reading of the guidelines that there's only a certain type of project that can really be funded with ARPA, and that's clearly just not the intention. So next slide, please. So what does this mean for arts and culture and the creative economy? The important thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of priority areas within the ARPA guidelines, but the good thing is that arts and culture line up with them very well. One of the keys is that a lot of the ARPA guidance focuses on economic recovery and economic restart and what creates a healthy and resilient economy. And we know that in Pennsylvania, the arts and culture sector contributes $26 billion to the state's economy, sustains 171,000 jobs, and supports or is composed of 23,000 plus businesses. So this is not an insignificant sector. It's not sort of a luxury item that it would be nice to support. It is a critical economic driver in our communities and in Pennsylvania statewide. That's not just true from a strictly economic impact perspective, but also from a lot of the things that economic policymakers care about, like talent attraction and workforce development. So increasingly, economic competitiveness, and this is something that I think a lot about because I come from an economic development organization, and we talk to businesses that are looking at multiple states, multiple countries to invest in. That our ability to attract those businesses is in a lot of ways based on placemaking and quality of life. And when you look at the stats around what recent college graduates want, what corporate executives want, a lot of it is based on quality of life considerations, and arts and culture and the amenities that support them are a critical piece to that. It used to be that businesses would approach organizations like mine and say, what are the best tax incentives I can get? How can I get the cheapest labor, and how close am I to a highway? And frankly, yeah, they still ask about those things, but increasingly they're also asked about what's the quality of life in this region and what amenities do you have to support that? And how am I going to attract the talent that I need based on the quality of life of that place? And obviously the places that invest in arts and culture will be able to be economically competitive, and those that don't simply won't. The other piece is workforce development and really trying to look at the skills that matter in our growing industries in Pennsylvania, including healthcare, manufacturing, industrial design. And we know that the arts and culture community and sector support those skill sets that are needed in workforce development, and that in general, investing in the creative economy leads to and correlates with overall economic growth. So I know many of us make the economic argument about arts and culture on a regular basis, but reminding people in the context of ARPA that if we are investing in economic recovery, arts and culture has a place is just really important. And you do have data that backs that up. Next slide, please. The other thing to keep in mind is that ARPA really wants communities to focus their funding where the need is greatest. And so they talk a lot about populations that have been disproportionately impacted or are vulnerable, or sectors of the economy that have been particularly vulnerable. And a lot of times those conversations are around hospitality and saying like, well, restaurants faced a lot of business restrictions. They've been significantly harmed. And that's true. But I think the arts and culture sector has just as good standing to say that among all the sectors, there has been a disproportionate impact due to COVID. You're probably even more familiar with some of these stats than I am that organizations have put out and studies that have been completed. But just running through some of them, 99% of organizations in the sector lost revenue from canceled events during the pandemic. 63% of creative workers experienced unemployment, and 95% lost a portion of their revenue. 37%, and this is a crazy figure, experienced food insecurity because of lost revenue or unemployment. The arts and culture sector has been identified as one of those that will lag the longest in terms of economic recovery. And while we've seen manufacturing and other sectors get back to their pre-pandemic employment levels, the arts and culture sector continues to lag in employment 12% from the pre-pandemic level. When you look at nonprofit sector broadly, which ARPA calls out as a vulnerable sector in general, arts organizations have suffered 3 times the job loss of the average nonprofit in America. And cumulatively, the losses are in excess of $18 billion for the industry. And of course, we know the economic ripple effect of the arts goes much further, so it's probably even much larger than that. So it's important to be able to point to either local data or national data or Pennsylvania data that says, look, we are a vulnerable industry. We've suffered disproportionate impacts, and that opens up the door to invest ARPA funding very clearly in this sector. The other piece is that, as you saw on the previous slide, the Treasury Department identified tourism as a vulnerable sector and a priority use of these funds. We know that in many communities, arts and culture, either through a specific facility or just broadly, are major drivers of tourism across Pennsylvania. And so as we restart Pennsylvania's tourism economy, investing in arts and culture has to be a major piece of that. So next slide, please. This one might feel a little unconventional, but I hope it doesn't for this audience, that arts and culture are also a critical element of our public health response and recovery. And as you saw, public health response and investing in the assets that helped with our public health response during the pandemic is a key use of these funds. During the last 18 months, the arts have only become more and more important to people's mental health, but also just their social lives, their way to build community. During the pandemic, 81% of Americans reported doing a creative activity during the pandemic, and those activities ranged widely, but all come back to the idea of focusing on creative activities to cope with the mental implications and social implications of the pandemic. That's a stat that my friend Kelly Gibson likes to hammer home to me. Artistic and creative activities have also been well documented as crucial coping mechanisms in navigating mental health. And so there are, it's not just this abstract concept. This is a recognized coping mechanism. And then finally, public art and creative placemaking have also played a long and well-documented role in creating safe and healthy communities. And there are parts of the U.S. Treasury's guidance that focus on taking funds and investing them in creating neighborhoods that have improved health and safety outcomes. And we know that arts and culture and creativity in general lead to better civic engagement, community investments, and those things that the U.S. Treasury wants to see. So I do think there's a strong public health argument to be made about investing in arts and culture organizations. Next slide, please. And the final way that I think this aligns very well is around the ARPA guidelines focus on equity. There's throughout the guidelines a focus on addressing longstanding racial and socio-demographic disparities that we find across Pennsylvania and across the country. And trying to get funds to historically disadvantaged communities, sectors, and businesses and organizations. Within the arts and culture sector, BIPOC arts organizations have been 17% less likely to return to in-person programming than other organizations. On average, BIPOC creatives have been more significantly impacted in terms of unemployment and lost revenue. And the U.S. Treasury says specifically recipients can identify other populations or groups. So they focus a lot in their guidance on CDBG census tracts, low and moderate income census tracts, areas of persistent poverty. But it's clear that within these guidelines, you have the discretion within your community to say, our BIPOC arts and culture organizations are among those that have faced disproportionate impacts from the pandemic. We've been subject to longstanding racial and sociodemographic disparities, and we'd like to invest in addressing those disparities. So there is an alignment with equity as well as just generally investing in communities that are diverse or experience persistent poverty. Next slide. So what does all that mean? It really opens the door widely, in my opinion. So what specific ways can the funds be spent? Again, this is a non-exclusive list of potential uses that you could consider if you're a county or municipal representative, or if you're advocating to one. But the development of new arts and culture facilities or rehabilitation of existing facilities directly aimed at supporting the creative economy, including museums, galleries, performing arts theaters, and educational facilities. When I give this presentation about conservation and park uses, I can say very clearly, investing in trails, investing in parks, investing in open space is also part of this tactic. But these kinds of capital expenditures are allowed underneath ARPA. And if you can tie them to these kinds of uses as part of your economic recovery, your public health recovery, they are eligible. You can also fund physical alterations to facilities to accommodate things like social distancing. So if you had to make physical changes inside your facility, shifting to hybrid programming, so investing in video cameras or Zoom accounts or other more sophisticated technology to provide your programming in a remote manner, outdoor programming and outdoor spaces, and other adaptations that aren't listed here that were a direct response to the pandemic. You can also fund arts and culture programming that was reduced or eliminated due to lost municipal revenue. So if your county or municipality has historically funded your local arts and culture programming, but said, hey, during the pandemic, we had to prioritize and we weren't able to fund it this year, they may use their funding to restore that programming and fully fund your work. Arts and culture programming that is undertaken to advance eligible infrastructure projects is also a good use of the funds. And this one, again, a little unconventional, but the ARPA guidelines are saying that they very much care about successfully advancing stormwater improvements, water quality projects, broadband expansion, and other infrastructure investments. The public arts and culture sector can play a very meaningful role in making those kinds of projects successful through civic engagement around the projects, about being able to solicit public input and understanding of the projects, building public arts and culture amenities into the projects themselves. And I think of great programs from groups like the PA Humanities Council, who are using things like storytelling and that kind of creative civic engagement to inform these kinds of planning processes around community change and about infrastructure investments. So there's no reason that if your community is investing a few $1 million in an infrastructure project, that they couldn't be also investing in organizations to help engage the community in those projects through arts and culture. Next slide, please. I think very commonly what you'll find in municipalities and counties is that they are very comfortable making direct allocations to specific organizations that they've long supported. And so a very easy use of these funds is for a county or a municipality to just make a direct allocation to an arts and culture organization. That could be, their critical, very large countywide public arts organization, or it could be your very small local group that's doing limited programming. There is no, it could be $1,000 allocation or it could be a few $100,000. There's nothing in the guidelines that dictates that. Music and performing arts venues, libraries, museums, archives, local and regional arts and culture commissions, including those associated with counties and municipal governments that might have slashed funding and now are able to restore it. Groups that are already sort of trying to do applied humanities and arts and culture work, like Main Streets and business improvement districts that might be doing creative placemaking, heritage and tourism organizations, historic sites, and even conservation landscapes that DCNR has across the state, and sometimes channel funding to arts and cultural projects. So next slide. The other way that counties and municipalities can get these funds out are through creating competitive grant programs. So not saying we're going to give to this specific list, but to create a pot of funding and allow people to apply to it. That could either be focused directly on arts and culture, or it could be to nonprofits of the entire community and say, hey, we're going to prioritize arts and culture as a vulnerable sector within that, and give a couple bonus points when we get applications from those organizations. Tourism and promotion agencies are also getting a lot of funding from counties and municipalities in some areas, and some areas not. But as they set up their grant programs or their list of direct allocations, municipalities or counties can dictate in their MOUs with tourism agencies to say, hey, we're going to give you $1 million. You're going to make that available to the community to promote tourism, and we want 25% going directly to arts and culture. We want 50% going to arts and culture. So there can be creative ways to not create projects or programs specifically for arts and culture, but to prioritize them within those kinds of programs. If you are looking at capital expenditures, like you have a theater that wants to, totally change its format and you need to invest $1 million in it, for example, there are some rules that go along with that, and that's where you would want to consult the guidelines a little more closely. But in general, if you're allocating less than $1 million for a capital project, the project needs to be consistent with all these guidelines that I just shared with you, but you don't even have to write a written justification to the Treasury if you're a municipality or county. You can just fund it. If it's over $1 million, you simply need to get your rationale and write it down on paper and say, hey, we saw that their attendance went down by X. They would have run a capital campaign, but they had to cancel it. We want to invest this money to get this project back on track. And that's the justification. Note that even if you're a county and municipality that's granting out this funding, all those organizations need to comply with the guidelines. So obviously it doesn't just become totally unrestricted funding when it's passed through. And that's why it's important to pick organizations and projects that align with these kinds of uses. Next slide. So to try to make this a little less abstract, I will share what we've done in York County to try to put some of these principles into play. And keep in mind, everything I'm about to talk to you about has already occurred. So this isn't like a few months from now, we're going to start cutting checks to arts and culture organizations. This has already happened. In York County, back in 2020, we created what was called the Yoko Strong Recovery Task Force. It was folks from across our community, from healthcare to law enforcement to the arts to nonprofits, to economic development. And we worked through work groups to come up with recommendations to our county commissioners about how to spend $40.5 million under the CARES Act, and then 76 million, something like that, under ARPA. That included representatives of our arts and culture community and broadly our nonprofit community. And what our task force came back with was a set of recommendations that included investing in the arts and culture sector. So under the CARES Act, which again, if it was eligible under CARES, it's eligible under the Rescue Act, our county allocated $930,000 to a variety of organizations in the arts and culture space, ranging from $200,000 to our largest performing arts venue to $5,000 to a small local arts group. All of the funds under the CARES Act were for COVID-related expenses and revenue losses. Again, that was a more restricted use of funds. Every partner of our cultural alliance in York County received a direct allocation, and we did that in coordination with the Cultural Alliance. And additionally, we ran a competitive grant program, and many arts and culture nonprofits and individual creatives received funding through that competitive grant program as well, because they were certainly an eligible type of business and type of nonprofit. When we had the chance to craft our response to ARPA with more money, we went back to that task force again, got a new set of recommendations. And again, those recommendations said, continue to fund arts and culture. So we invested $1.83 million of ARPA funding in arts and culture. That included one very significant commitment of $1 million to a capital project, which was York County History Center's new facility in a former MedEd steam plant. You can see the rendering there, but also included going back to all those same organizations that we had deemed really important under the CARES Act, and funding them all again, to making sure that, you know, they had probably exhausted their funds in 2020 when they received that CARES Act allocation, and wanted to give them another allocation. The important thing here is that if you're in a county or municipality where you've gotten any pushback to say, hey, we're not sure if this is a good fit, we're not allowed to do this, this has already happened in York County, which is not a, you know, not a small county. We have 450,000 residents, and if it didn't fly, we would now know that. And we were able to fund museums, arts and education organizations, performing arts venues and individual groups, dance companies, symphonies, orchestras, arts guilds, arts councils, pretty much the broad range of organizations engaged in the arts and culture sector in capital improvement projects. So if you ever are in a conversation where somebody's saying, we don't think that's a good fit, here's a great example that you can point to say, look, it's already happened. It's already happening in other parts of Pennsylvania. And I'm sure other counties and municipalities have similar stories. Next slide, please. And I am getting close to wrapping up. So just a couple logistics here. If you're thinking about making a request for these funds, your county has already or municipality has already begun receiving funds back in June of 2021. Many counties are having very transparent processes and municipalities about how to spend these funds. They're creating task force. They might have a committee. They might have a portal to accept ideas. And others are just sort of deciding it themselves and not having real public processes. So it's really important to reach out and figure out what the process is. But there is time to provide input on getting these funds for your uses locally. All Rescue Act funds must be obligated by the government by December 31st, 2024. So that is a more significant timeline, and all the funds have to be expended by December 31st of the next year. So even if you have a complex multi-phase project, or you want to fund certain organizations over a multi-year period, you certainly can as a county or municipality. You cannot go back retroactively, though. March 31st, 2021, anything incurred after that can be covered with these funds, even if you just request and receive them now. But you can't go back before that because that's what the CARES Act covered. Counties and cities had to submit a one-time interim report and now have reporting requirements. So if you heard that your municipality or county had to submit their plan on how they were going to spend the funds, that might seem like it's all set in stone and you don't have a chance to influence that conversation. That's not the case. A lot of those plans are just saying, we're going to spend $10 million on nonprofit support. We're going to spend $5 million on revenue replacement. A lot of the communities have not had to say, we're giving $10,000 to this group, we're giving $15,000 to this group. Some have, and they've already set those plans in motion, and others have been sitting back and waiting for this final roll and haven't spent a single dollar, allocated a single dollar. So if you heard that your community already submitted their plan, try to figure out if that's an actual plan or if that was just sort of checking the box on the Treasury. Next slide. So what should you do right now? If you are interested in pursuing these funds, reach out to your county or municipal leadership and understand what their process is. If you are that leadership in your region, start to consider using these funds for arts and culture because of the significant impact it has. It varies in different municipalities and counties who's running these processes. Sometimes it's a planning commission, sometimes it's an economic organization, sometimes it's a municipal manager or township supervisor. It really varies, so try to understand that. Getting your request in writing and making it formal, so it's not just a conversation or an email, but you're making a direct ask to your municipality for these funds and outlining why it's important. Sharing this presentation with your county or municipal leadership, because we know there hasn't been a lot of great guidance on how funds can be used at a very local level. So communities are looking for that kind of guidance, including solicitors who are trying to do the legal interpretation of this guidance. And tying your work to things that are specifically mentioned in the ARPA guidelines. So if you can make a business case, if you can make an economic development case, if you can tie it to tourism, if you can use it to implement infrastructure, you don't need to, because there's other ways to justify this funding. It's just something that resonates very well with policymakers, and you can see it in the guidelines, and that gives a certain level of comfort. Next slide. You can also, don't be coy about the impact that you have. Don't be humble. A lot of the times, nonprofits undersell the impact they have on the community, especially during the pandemic. And I think it's fair that at this moment in time, we all sort of ring the bells on why this sector is so important. Use data to back that up. If you have it, use your local data. If you don't, there's great national data out there that you can sort of extrapolate down to the local level. Use telling examples and case studies, and use your creativity about how to, best engage your municipality or your county and get them interested in your work. Next slide. So there's just a handful of things you shouldn't do, which I think are worth mentioning. Wait, because the ball is rolling on this, and communities are coming up with their plans. There's still a window in most cases, but that window is getting shorter and shorter. Don't let someone brush you off. I've heard from lots of municipalities that wanted to invest in creative ways that they were using ARPA, and they reached out to somebody. There's not to bad talk solicitors, but they're solicitors sometimes, or a federal official that doesn't want to commit to anything, and understandably so. The inclination is to read these guidelines as narrowly as possible and be as conservative as possible in their interpretation. That is not what Treasury intended. They've been very clear about that. So if somebody says, absolutely, that's not eligible, don't be rude, don't burn bridges, but it is fair to question that and point to some of the resources that are out there and some of the communities that are already using the funds for those purposes. And finally, of course, don't misuse the funds or try to get funds if you don't need them. They are intended to help with the recovery from the pandemic. There's enough legitimate uses that I've just cataloged for you without trying to bend the rules to make them work for your organization or your sector. And I think with that, the last slide is just my email address. If you want to reach out after this and ask any additional questions, or conversely, if you feel like you guys are doing this really well already, the more examples that we have of people that are using these funds creatively and wisely, the better, because I think it sends some confidence to other communities that they should be doing the same. So with that, I'll turn it over to the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Silas. Lots of great information. And folks, please put your questions in the chat. We'll get to those when we get to the Q&A session. And just to point out again, in the follow-up email, we will have the link to the recording with contact information, slides, all the great stuff that has been presented today and will be talked about. Okay, so our next speaker is Marc Folk. Marc Folk is the president and CEO of the Arts Commission in Toledo, Ohio. And he's going to talk about his experience, the arts sector's experience in Toledo, successfully advocating for ARPA funds.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for virtually welcoming me to your state. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm kind of in the midst of the process, and I'll talk about this a little bit more. We've been successful in securing an allocation for the sector from the city and the county, but not yet the release of those funds. So in Toledo and Lucas County, what the local government has chosen to do is to pass ordinances that have plans put together on how the funds will be distributed to set the framework for the release of the funds over the coming year into 23 into 24 as they have the requirements to allocate those funds. And I really think, I was on a webinar yesterday presenting about this between LISC Creative Placemaking and the National Endowment for the Arts. And one of the issues that came up is just to keep in mind that every single place in the country has access to this money, and every single place is going to do it a little bit differently as they go forward. So just to ground our organization, we're a separate 501c3 nonprofit organization that was created by the city to serve as a local arts agency for the city of Toledo and the county. So we operate at the intersection of grant making, placemaking, public art, policy, community health, civic engagement, and really, do whatever we can as an essential partner to help build and sustain the local cultural ecosystem. We've been working, since the release of the initial funds to track where they're going, and we've been able to secure some funds for youth employment in the arts from the city. The county's made some investment in the convention center, and they're including public art in that. But what I really want to focus on today is the way that we've come together in coalition to ask for funds to help support the overall cultural ecosystem in Northwest Ohio. Again, as a local arts agency, we have a series of tactics that we do through our individual programs like placemaking, grants for artists, public art. But we really also work in coalition to advance the whole sector. And as we've been moving through the pandemic, we've been focusing on the fact that art is work, and really helping to build capacity for our smaller organizations, continue to develop and advance public space through the arts while people are separated, deepening our diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments to the community. And as I mentioned before, sustaining the local ecosystem. Coalitions are critical, and starting out, Silas mentioned data before, starting out with the power and the impact of the cultural sector and what it does for the economy is a great way to lead your intro for the ask. For the past probably 15 years, there's been an informal alliance of about 20 cultural organizations in Northwest Ohio that refer to themselves as the Toledo Area Cultural Leaders. Combined, those organizations have about a $200 million annual operating budgets. They spend over $5 million in marketing our region and have over 12 million annual visitors. So we have that massive impact to the local economy, as was talked about before. And we have huge employment numbers. There are about 2,800 people working just in the county in the arts and creative industries. About 43% of those are independent artists. And all the, there's annual revenue of about $62 million. And you can take that all the way, into how the end user or the attendee to our events spend an additional $30 at every event that they go to. So that kind of the data is your friend in getting the door open in the process. It has been for us, and we were able to flip that immediately when the shutdown happened to state that during full shutdown, artists in our county were losing about $332,000 per week. That our nonprofit sector was losing about $2.5 million per week. And that was, as Silas mentioned, the compound losses to the ancillary industries that benefit from our existence. In October in Ohio, the arts and entertainment sector was at about a 20.3% unemployment rate, the highest of any sector in the state. We were the first to close, the last to open. But the ancillary effects, we saw leisure and hospitality down at the next level at 8.26% and accommodation and food at 6% unemployment. So, we know when people come to our events and our activities, they support the rest of the business ecosystem, and we have partners that can help advocate for us. And the way it's really been framed by the Ohio Citizens for the Arts in our state and advocating that this is frankly a business crisis. This is not an arts crisis. And we operate businesses just like anyone else. We're dealing with muted and changed demand, new customer expectations. All of us have had to pivot and can figure out how we sustain what we've been doing and then go virtually and present to the community in a new way, sometimes oscillating back and forth between those over a series of months. There are operational and financial challenges with increased health and safety expenses. Our smallest organizations already have a really low financial resiliency. And because many of us are nonprofits, we already function with slim operating margins as it is. And the bottom line is, as many things start to bounce back, we're not yet in recovery. We're still in rescue mode right now. So as we've tracked the different opportunities, and I'll just go a little bit deeper in process with the hopes that it'll be helpful for you. When the CARES Act funding came out, as Silas had mentioned, it was designed to get out very quickly and help mitigate the impact of the pandemic as fast as possible. In Ohio, that was available through two direct sources. One was the National Endowment for the Arts, and the other was the Ohio Arts Council. With the Ohio Arts Council, or let's start with the National Endowment for the Arts, you would have had to have been a funding recipient in the last 2 years to be eligible for those funds. And at the state level in Ohio, you would have had to receive general operating support through the Arts Council within the last 2 years to be eligible for those funds. So it was a way to get those funds out quickly and really help support the sector. But it was somewhat inequitable, and it left behind many of our individual artists and our smaller organizations who hadn't yet gotten that support. So I had, I would just say, and I'll kind of close with this as well. Again, relationships are critical. Make relationships with your elected officials. That's been critical to our success at this point. But if you're not there yet, start now. It's not too late. And you can keep, you're going to need to have a good advocacy policy going forward and have those relationships. We were lucky enough to have those here. And as the CARES Act money was restricted in how it was used, we were able to collaborate and figure out, and this is another key point, where these dollars are going are opening up an opportunity for the dollars that were already committed to those spaces that may have unrestricted use. For example, last year, in order to help across the state, and because everyone was working from home, the governor this was 2020, he refunded all of the worker compensation payments across the state of Ohio. What that meant was all of a sudden there was unrestricted money. And while we were trying to activate these CARES Act dollars, we were able to win a joint investment from the city and county. And that's another point I would really make that's been successful for us is building a relationship and a dual investment between your municipality and your county. They'd like to leverage the investment, and when those workers' compensation funds were returned, we were able to win support for a $450,000 fund to help support small organizations and individual artists to get that money out the door. We were awarded the funds, set up the system, and got it out to community in about 6 weeks. And about 60% of the organizations that were awarded funds were either BIPOC or culturally specific organizations or focused on accessibility. And we were also able to grant funding out to 119 artists to help them endure, which was the winter surge of 2021. What we also did immediately as that was happening, we were the American Rescue Plan Act was beginning to happen, and we began our pitch to our city and county through the Toledo area cultural leaders to ask for support. And I'll just kind of in a real time scenario, we asked for $11 million that would be regranted out through the Arts Commission from the city. That turned into an $11 million ask from the city and county. Some of the organizations in the community chose to go after individual projects outside of the coalition, which is completely fine, but it reduced funding and they weren't successful in getting those awards. And again, relationships, coalitions, they've been really successful for us. All said and told, we ended up winning support for about $6 million from our city and county, and have put together a program to invest $4 million in large and mid-sized organizations in the county, at $1.5 million to smaller organizations and individual artists, and $500,000 to support staff and build capacity to support recovery. There is, structural inequity that exists. Many of the organizations of color are historically smaller organizations. When we went through that grant cycle, we found many in our community who were functioning as nonprofits, but weren't incorporated as nonprofits, who were thus ineligible for any of this support. So we really want to dedicate some of these resources to build the resiliency of our community over time. Also the important, again, it's an evolving exercise of relationship development and data development. Because of the way we were able to win support to help our individual artists and our smaller organizations, we were able to capture data to help us win support from the National Endowment for the Arts for one of the ARPA sub-granting funds. And we were one of the communities, along with our colleagues over in Pittsburgh, who received $500,000 from the NEA as a sub-granting entity to get back out. And those dollars, about 350,000 of those, will be sub-granted out to small organizations in the 15 counties of Northwest Ohio as we work through this period of pretty stark at times political polarization. We can use the arts as an agent to help build urban-rural solidarity and really tell the story about how culture impacts life everywhere, and use that as a platform to hopefully secure more resources in the future. So, you know, there are additional funds for artists in there through our through our existing programs to help advance inclusion and equity. And we're working on moving all of this forward, one from the city and county towards the release of the appropriation. They just both approved their annual budgets as recent as this week. We're going to launch this application process in June and really we'll probably launch the NEA funding much sooner. But the city county at an event in June to really get that rolled out and make sure people have time in advance to build the capacity and have the proper documentation together that they need to meet the requirements of the funding source, and then continue to advocate towards whatever resources become available as we go forward. So just in close, I would just, highlight the importance of relationships, networks, and ecosystems. If you're not there yet, start your relationships now. We all have to start at some point. Our city legislative director used to own a coffee shop that I went to when I was actually a young practicing artist. Our county administrator worked for a mayor administration 3 mayors ago, where we started that understanding of what the arts do for the community. And I think those longer term development of relationships are needed into the future. Whether or not you receive this funding, it's something that you should be working towards. Don't get overwhelmed if you haven't started, but do start now. Advocacy is critical. And I would say, we talk a lot about in this sector about knowledge transfer, about succession planning. I would encourage you to take the young leaders in your organizations with you through this process, so they're building a muscle memory for the future. We went through here in Toledo the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and we're able to get some funding there. And that really steadied us when we headed into the pandemic, because we knew we had experience with crisis before, and we've been able to transfer some of these lessons into our team, so our staff are more capable to deal with these types of crises in the future. The last 2 points I'll say, data matters. It opens up doors, but these are human relations, and really build those relationships with your elected officials. The data makes the case for it, but this is really, we're going through a human crisis, and our elected officials are also human, and there's an opportunity to really connect there because they do care. And then lastly, watch where this money's being invested. And as far as you are looking at what is eligible, watch what your local government is spending it on and what may become available because they're making that investment. And just really watch where the flexibility is, and don't be afraid to ask for some of those resources to support your community. And again, thank you for welcoming me from Ohio. It's great to be here with you today.
Thank you, Marc. These are really great points and lots of great information. So my colleague Nora Johnson is helping with the chat. Nora, I have a pretty long list here of things that are popping up on my side, but I don't know if you want to start off by throwing out some questions that have shown up in the chat.
Sure. So Silas or Marc, what if you received significant federal funding via the SVOG program? Can you still pursue ARPA allocations?
I don't believe there are any restrictions for previous funding. The only restriction that I'm aware of is you can't go after ARPA funding from 2 different sources for the same expenses.
Yep, I just agree with that, you know, if you're requesting funds for capital project or for programming, but you've already received funding from another source for the same thing, especially if it's other ARPA funding, that would be the only reason you couldn't.
Okay, thank you, both of you. Here is a question, Silas. I think it's just a point of clarification about one of the slides you shared. Somebody asks, only eligible for costs incurred on or before March 3rd, 2021, is what the slide reads. Is this correct? It sounds like this is supposed to be for costs incurred after that date.
Yep, if that's what it says, it was incorrect. It should be for anything after that date.
Okay, that's easy enough. No. Let's see. Somebody asks, I think I know the answer to this, but is my organization eligible for ARPA funds if we received PA SHARP funding? Now, SHARP is through the Humanities Council, or PA Humanities rather. So I would say yes, but if either of you think otherwise, because
no,
this is for the
again, I think ultimately that SHARP funding came to the Humanities Council from the NEH, from U.S. Treasury, from ARPA. So to Mark's point, as long as you're not using it for the same use that you used your SHARP grant, then I think you're fine.
Right.
I have a question. Let me just grab it really quick. So it's one that somebody had asked me just in an email. Because they had read this too, and you actually addressed it on the same slide. Silas, could you just elaborate on what it means that the local government has to have obligated the funds by December 31st, 2024?
Yeah, that just means that they have to make, if it's their own funding and they're keeping it, they have to have allocated it to a specific purpose. If they're passing it through to someone else, they have to have passed it through, but that recipient organization doesn't have to expend the funds for another year. So unlike the CARES Act, where it was allocated and expended both by the end of that calendar year, this is sort of giving, even more flexibility that, you get a whole other year to actually expend those funds after they've been allocated.
Great.
Sarah, you want me to take another?
Sure.
So somebody asks, which elected officials would you recommend we prioritize reaching out to?
Who do you know? Where are your relationships? It's been our experience here that the county administrator or the legislative counsel to the mayor's office are the ones that are responsible for putting the packages or the requests into the plan that the city moves forward. So, and then obviously, or at least here we have a strong mayor model, and the council has to approve what happens there. So I would start with, where you have the relationship, and then I would move to the administrators to find out, because your elected officials are being hit from every angle with every idea that anybody has ever had on how to use these funds. And many of those don't have, organizations don't have the capacity to implement the funding if it was awarded. So the administrators or those top level support positions for your elected officials will help guide you through that.
And just to give the Pennsylvania, local perspective, this is one situation where your state rep, your state senator really has no influence in this process. It's a pass through from DCD, and even DCD staff really don't have much discretion. And if you've reached out to them looking for guidance, you've probably found that they're also trying not to give direct guidance on what's eligible and what's not. So it is really a situation where it's at your municipal level or your county level, your county commissioners as the top elected official, or your township supervisors or borough council as the top elected officials.
Great.
So and then once you get one, I would just add, once you get one of them, you get your county, I would go to your city, and ask them if they would match, because they find comfort. I mean, for us, there's comfort knowing that there's partnership.
Yeah, great points. Okay, so I have one that just came up in the chat, so I'll ask this one, Nora. Our project had an allocation in the Build Back Better. Of course, the Build Back Better is stalled, and we have no idea if the funding will be allocated for the Cultural Life Arts Center. But is there any conflict with pursuing ARPA funds?
I don't think there is. The only conflict that would arise is if Build Back Better is passed and then you get funding for the exact same purpose. Goes back to what we said a couple times about that double dipping for the same expenses. But applying for funding that duplicates funding that right now is just hypothetical and, you know, just potential funding, I would say you want to have a backup to that. And the ARPA funding is the funding that exists now. It's real. So I'd say go after that now and tweak the other one if you're successful in getting the allocation.
Yeah, completely agree.
We have another question here from an individual who's with an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that was not eligible for CARES funding because of that structure. Is there eligibility for such an organization for use with ARPA funds? I
would assume yes. I mean, in the traditional, or at least the most conservative interpretation, it would at least be for any overhead expense or any programmatic expense that had been lost or unavailable due to the pandemic. Or you can go, you know, because many at the release of the final rule, the cities and counties were much more empowered to recover any revenue lost, and that's going to open up some flexibility in their current general operating budget, or potentially for this year. So I would encourage you to go after it.
Great. So I think you both touched on. Oh, I'm sorry. Silas, did you want to?
Just to reaffirm what Marc was saying, and just to give you some reassurance, in York County, we funded all volunteer organizations with both CARES and ARPA, because payroll is one expense, but as Marc said, overhead, utilities, rent were all eligible expenses. Revenue loss was revenue loss that you could document with expenses was eligible. And then under ARPA, it's much less restrictive. So there's no reason an all volunteer organization couldn't get funded.
Great. So yeah, I think you both touched on this a little bit. I know, Marc, you referred to like art is work, right? That was kind of one of the pillars or the foundation of how you were talking about the sector. So there's a question, you know, speaking about strategy, do you think it's wise to be in a strategy, an advocacy strategy, to be more art specific, or to think more broadly in terms of like that idea that, you know, the small business and or nonprofit sector as a whole? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Silas, you want to take this one first?
Yeah, I can take a stab at it and saying, I think it's going to depend a lot on who your audience is, and you're going to know the realities of what resonates with your county commissioner or your, you know, county administrator or your local elected officials more so than others. I think there's some that will be incredibly receptive to all the non-economic, non-business justifications for funding arts. And then there's going to be some that could not care less about it and will only be motivated by an economic argument or a business argument. The great thing about arts and culture is you have both. So you can either make both arguments or you can make one or the other. And I think Marc spoke to that a little bit in sort of the relationship building piece of it, and knowing who you're talking to and what they see the value of the arts as.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's all about knowing your audience and crafting the message, and then looking to see if what coalition you may build or may be able to join that would have the greatest, you know, potential for success.
So I think, and both of you, you know, cited data in your talk. And I know, Marc, you also said data is your friend, right? So I know somebody earlier in the chat had asked, you know, Silas, in your presentation, if there's some kind of, you know, if you have like those data sources that you cited in the slides, if there's a list of those so people could, you know, possibly go check them out. But I guess my question would be, let's just say I am in a community, I direct a small arts organization, and we're getting together with some other folks in the sector in my community to advocate for these funds. But we haven't done any research locally around, economic loss, employment changes, those sort of things. Is there a place that somebody can go to find more specific local data? Are there sources out there that folks might not know about that you would recommend?
Just so the first part of that question, and hopefully Mark can bail me out. I should have made it more explicit. I did try to tag each of those data points with the source. So some are Americans for the Arts, some are specific, academic research that's happened. And I should say, some of those were data points I was aware of already, and some I got the same way that you guys all will, which is like Googling COVID impact on the arts and then seeing if it's a legit source or not. I do think that even if you don't have any local data, you can take something that says, 99% of organizations lost revenue. And that's a federal stat. You don't know if that's true of every organization in your region, but then you can back that up with saying, and for example, our performing arts, venue lost X amount of revenue. So you might know for one or two organizations, and they're sort of telling case studies or data points that are local that make the national data seem a little less abstract and a little more relevant to your local situation. I would also say you can look, and I think it might be tough to do this on your own if you don't have the ability to work with like an economic analyst, which most of us don't. But the BEA does break down the sector, by employment size for states, for some regions. So there are ways to get at data around employment in the arts sector and how it's changed over time. Just how granular that information is going to be the tricky part for individual organizations to go after that data,
Right.
in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I can share the Bureau of Economic Analysis information when I send a follow-up email to everybody for Pennsylvania. That's some really great data that Silas is speaking about.
I would direct folks. Americans for the Arts are generating data, and it's kind of the national standard bearer. They have some information before the pandemic as well, and that's what we've been using. If you're a member, you can get a local arts and creative businesses report. I think the last year it was done was either 18 or 17, and we use that all the time as a local comparison to say, there are 400 arts-related businesses employing over 3,000 people, which is more than Jeep and Libby Glass combined, two signature industries. So there's a comparative way to do that. Frankly, in Ohio, our Citizens for the Arts has been working really hard to get ARP funding out of the legislature. And so they're doing monthly or bi-monthly statewide advocacy talking points that's tracking the data in the state of Ohio. And then we're in the midst. They're kind of playing the fulcrum for us right now, but we're in the midst of an economic it's condition/impact study where the 7 regions of the state of Ohio have all come together to make an investment in data to compare where our sector is against the other sectors in Ohio in real time, and then to use that once those relationships are built to understand how they can help us parse out more specific local data going forward. That kind of data, this is another great place. If you don't have the relationships, just start because you'll need, a longitudinal look at that over time. Really helps make the case for you as well.
Great.
And then it's people, like I said, data's the door opener. If you have, I could go into a council person's office and not have any relationship with them. And I could bring a guest with me that has the relationship. And then that's the compelling case. There's all kinds of crazy things that have happened in the last couple of years. And in Toledo, the day before council was to vote on police reform after George Floyd's murder, the the FBI came in and swept 4 of the 5 members of the African American caucus on council on corruption charges before the vote could happen. So we had other relationships with the people that were appointed to those council seats beforehand, across our organization in the cultural sector. And we were able to continue to have the support we were working towards, even with that sudden loss of elected leadership.
Interesting. Are there any other, have you seen any other questions, Nora?
I'm sorry, my sound was out for a second. So we have one question about addressing, like strategy wise, is it good to, it says arts specific or part of a small.
I already did that one.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
It must have been when you're, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, not a problem, not a problem. Is
So,
there anybody else on the call that has a question for either one of our wonderful presenters? Okay. I think you guys, your presentations were so thorough. We don't have a million questions. So, I mean, that's a great thing. I'm sure people will go away and think about this discussion though, and possibly have questions moving forward. So, oh wait, I just see something popping up here really quick. Oh, just said this has been great. Thank you. And that's what I'd like to say. Thank you both so much for taking your time. This is a really important subject. And folks, be watching out for that follow-up email with all the things I've promised you. And thanks for spending some time with us today, and take care and stay healthy and happy and safe.
Thank you.